Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Due Diligence and Data Protection, what you need to close a Series A, B, or C funding. So I'm Lisa Hoffmann, the Chief Legal Operations Officer at Pridatect and a legal specialist and certified in data protection. I am very happy to have here with me today David Clark. David is one of the UK's most renowned experts in privacy and cybersecurity. Furthermore, he's recognized as one of the top 10 influencers by Thomson Reuters' top 30 most influential thought leaders on social media in risk management, compliance, and RegTech in the UK. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, great. Thanks for having me on the broadcast today. Yeah, it's great. And yeah, as you said, I've got a background doing a lot of cyber, a lot of data protection, and I think, as we all know, it's really kind of ramped up probably in the last 4 years, 5 years. 5 years ago, I think kind of people were still thinking data protection. People were kind of crazy, telling them what was going to happen, and I think we've actually seen most of it fulfilled. It is coming of age. So yeah, kind of really interesting area to be
in. Great. Thank you so much. And of course, not to forget, the audience can ask questions the whole time throughout the webinar. And if they view the webinar afterwards, you can send it to my email address and we will happily answer to their questions. So let's start. This webinar is about data link security. So we speak about audit of large funds and of course taking into account here the GDPR always. Then we will speak a little bit about the due diligence process and how you can share data with the investors correctly, safe, and secure. And last but not least, do you want to say something?
Oh, fine, thanks. Sorry.
No, and last but not least, we speak about data protection and the product roadmap. So your company grows and changes, and during this process, you have to ensure compliance, of course, as well. So compliance is not a one-time thing. So due diligence and data protection, is your company ready? This is the big question. We will hopefully help you to answer throughout this webinar. We will speak about due diligence and why it is such an important part of the pre-investment screening, because investors have to make sure and reduce liabilities and secure the post-investment purchase valuation. Data protection is one of the most important aspects of the due diligence. This is why we will have a close look and of course give here some tips and help you through this process. So then, David, let's get right into.
Yeah, I think this is becoming a much hotter area than maybe it was a few years ago. You know, especially at Trust Keith, we work with a lot of startups. Sometimes they're pre-revenue, sometimes they've been going a couple of years. And what we've noticed is, you know, investors are asking tougher questions. Quite often when we start work with a startup, they'll go, well, we don't really kind of need to worry about this stuff. And then this has happened to us maybe, I don't know, 3-4 times now in a row. We'll get a call from their CEO or chairman saying, you know, you were telling us about how to handle due diligence questions. We've just been sent this form. I think some of the worst forms we've seen have over, you know, 400 or 500 questions. And sometimes it's a little bit unfair, especially on some pre-revenue startups, especially because they may not necessarily have live data at that time, but they've got to at least show their strategy and their intent for managing cybersecurity and data protection, how they're going to do it, how they're going to do it when they scale up. And quite often, and I don't know if this is done deliberately, a lot of the forms almost infer that they want a yes or no answer, but quite often, if you do just put yes or no answers, you're asking for the next level of questions, which can be really tough. So we try and make sure that those questions get answered, you know, fully, properly, and if we're lucky, we don't get too much of a follow-up of very detailed questions, except in specific areas. The other kind of area that we've seen this a lot, we've seen this, you know, we're almost a facilitator for businesses to grow now, because often the due diligence questions from a major customer can be just as tough, if not harder. And unless you pass that due diligence, you don't get to play with much bigger companies who are used to doing this all day long. So often this is seen as a barrier to entry and a restriction on getting large contracts and new business. So yeah, we do this pretty frequently, and I got to say that the companies where we're there really happy once we've effectively closed the deal for them. So we're the hidden sales force behind their actual sales force. And as we've got on the slide here, it's not kind of just about cybersecurity. It's about data protection, and data protection is, you could say, is the next level up. It's how you use that data. There's other legislation that surrounds it, such as PECA, Privacy Electronic Communication Regulation, which regulates how you can use text and email. So they've all got to be interlinked, because you may have a lot of data, but you may not be able to maybe use it in the way that you thought you could. And if you do, you need to make sure that the groundwork is set, so your business is kind of scalable and can be kind of managed from a data protection perspective. We've seen in the past, and I'm sure everyone knows about these, the Yahoo sale was a famous one where the price kind of tumbled down the more was found out about the breach. Same thing, unfortunately, with Marriott hotels. Same issue there. They inadvertently bought the results of a breach. And that's now a real concern, because this is kind of liability beyond the functions of a business. A business may fail because it's not doing well at sales, but actually it can fail, and the cost can go well beyond the cost of initial investment. If there's fines, class actions, that could happen. So yeah, the risks can be high, and it's how are those risks managed, and how do investors manage them? It's got to be proportionate. No one's going to be, like government level security, but it's got to be proportionate to the business they're in. They're dealing with child data, medical data. It's got to be proportionate to the risks that they're involved with.
Absolutely. So it's safe to say that a lack of compliance has a significant impact on the outcome in an investment round.
Absolutely, and I think compliance, it's come of age for IT. We've never really had some strong legislation to manage effectively what is IT. We've had good legislation from 1923, when aircraft was regulated. You couldn't just make an aircraft and fly it anywhere. All those regulations came in. Same for cars in the 70s. You can't build a dangerous car. The risk calculations, and for this from memory, I think the value of a life in the 70s was regarded as $50,000, but when you make $300 million from selling a range of cars, you can afford 20-30 lives lost. That was outlawed. That's illegal to do those type of calculations. Risk against life. Cars had to be made safe. And I think the one thing, unfortunately, that we probably all know is that IT is inherently unsafe. We know most of it is a breach waiting to happen, and it's how can we mitigate that and effectively get IT into the 21st century, because I think we're trailing a bit behind.
Absolutely, I can say this the same in the German jurisdiction. So let's speak a bit about the breaches liability we mentioned before.
Yeah, and this was something a lot of us were talking about before GDPR, that the concept of breaches liability, that you don't necessarily need a breach to be liable. And I think we've seen this numerous times now, where in summary, misuse of data. We've seen this with the big tech giants. We've seen this, I think there's been a couple of cases, probably in Germany, where retention periods weren't being followed, and there've been fines for that. Yeah. We've seen kind of fines for, and there are areas still coming up which are new every day. And talking to a lot of data protection professionals, the amount of knowledge that we all have to absorb now pretty much every day, interpreting, new enforcement notices, new angles on data. And I think the more we look into it, the more complex it gets. I think the model sounds very simple, but when you look at what companies are now doing with data, how they're dealing, real-time bidding for adverts, it's unbelievably complicated, and almost some of the things may be kind of stretching to the limit now on data protection that maybe it wasn't fully designed for.
Absolutely, you have all these different interpretations also. everywhere. So absolutely, I see it also very difficult to get at one angle here.
Yeah, I mean, I think
So
the first class action, wasn't it? It was in, funnily enough, was in the US, wasn't it? Against Nielsen's, where the shareholders took Nielsen's, initiated a class action because they didn't feel that Nielsen's were GDPR ready, inverted commas, that they hadn't done enough work. So, you know, no breach, but people were worried about it.
yeah. So let's speak a bit about important aspects of data protection for investors here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember we talked to an early startup not long ago, and you know, the conversation sort of went like this: do you capture any personal data? No, not really. We just kind of capture maybe when they log on. And then after a lot more questioning, you know, what we found out is, yeah, they capture the name, the email address, their location data. So effectively, they had a whole picture of that data subject. And, you know, yes, some of that data is going to maybe critical to the function of your business, but I suspect in these cases, it wasn't necessary that they needed to capture all that data. And if they did, they didn't need to hold on to it for a particularly long period. So it's kind of using data appropriately. And we're seeing this challenge now. We know, you know, big tech and the government probably have access to huge amounts of data about us, what we do, where we go, and now we're turning that into a COVID app. You know, and it's kind of interesting. You know, the data is available. One of the things we've seen is, I know Israel has started this, and they've used it, I think, for a couple of months, and now they've got concerns about whether the government is getting too invasive into, you know, using this data. So it's getting that balance right, because at the end of the day, we all want to be safe, we don't want to be ill, but it's how do we use this data appropriately, and that there's no further actions that can be done on this data to kind of, you know, compromise us in the future. Marketing data is always great fun. If we talk to clients in the US, you can buy databases with 1,500 data points on a subject. You know, we know what color shirt they bought 2 weeks ago, for example. We in Europe, we tend not to have that level of data. So in the US, personal data has been a thing to be traded and to be used. And to some extent, it makes sense because businesses have to make money, but it's using this appropriately and you know, not putting distress on the data subject.
What I could see also is that data protection really gets more and more important in an investment process, just because the investors want to see more of the data security, also more of the products, of course, are evolving the privacy data, everything. So they want to see, of course, that it's also handled securely, because this later could fall completely on your feet if you have data security not installed in your company. So of course, investors check for that.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just data security to protect the company from, you know, the guys in hoods. It's quite often, you know, inadvertent data breaches inside the company, and some that, you know, could be classified as a data breach, but maybe not have a huge effect. You know, there's a good example in the UK's Data Protection Authority where they, and I'm paraphrasing here, where they give an example of a hospital worker looks at the wrong record, and that record they shouldn't really have had access to. But the problem is, you know, they shouldn't have had that, but they did. So that's potentially a breach. But you can kind of see that the maths unfortunately really add up. You know, you can have millions of records, thousands of staff, thousands of patients, and you multiply that all together, and you can have, you know, 100 million data points to manage. And how do you manage it? 1% error means a million data points aren't controlled properly. So although it sounds simple to do it, it's actually a big challenge, even with a lot of the tools we have today.
So what did you notice? What are investors looking for in the data protection of a company mostly? What do they want to see?
I think a lot of it is they want to make sure that the company actually understands the problem and it's not a superficial understanding. You know, one of the things that we, you know, at Trust Keith, we always kind of say is, you know, your outside consultant should know what the problem is, But when you're talking to investors and auditors, they want to also see that the company themselves understand the problem. Yeah, they may not have the kind of deep technical knowledge, but they understand that data and cybersecurity have to be managed, maintained. And it's something that you and I were talking about earlier. It's not a one-time thing. You know, if you're training for a marathon, you can't just go out and do one run and go, you know what, I'm kind of good to go. It's constantly looking at, you know, what you eat, how you train on a regular basis. And, you know, there's similarities to cyber and data protection. It's got to be reviewed all the time. We know IT changes all the time, people's roles change all the time, and it's keeping a handle on that. Yeah, it's not easy, but it is a cost of doing safe business. It's a bit like the aircraft industry. I'm sure in 1923 they went completely mad about having to make planes safe. But now, you know, the industry is phenomenal. Well, it was phenomenal till 5 weeks ago, but you know, it enables scalability. So doing things safely and properly and making sure that things are done appropriately to the right level makes a huge difference.
Absolutely. You shouldn't be GDPR compliant just for the investors, but basically for your company and for being able to grow. Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely. And I think from what we've seen a number of customers, you know, and they're just booming, and they are very rigorous on their cyber and their data protection. And the reason why they're booming is they deal with a lot of blue chip companies, and those companies, you know, they just don't have any worries about dealing with them because this company can demonstrate every capability from cyber to data protection. And so by default, they get the work. It's quite amazing, yeah.
Yeah. So let's speak a bit more about the whole due diligence process of shared data and what needs to be considered here when sharing the data for due diligence.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've got on the list here anonymization of data, and one of the interesting issues about that, there's no real standardization of what anonymization means. I think we all kind of know what it means, but actually, how do you verify that something is anonymized? And for a while, when people told me they anonymized data, I never used to check it. I used to think, oh, they know what they're doing. Technical guys know what they're doing. I won't actually look at the data. And then one day I looked at the data and I realized looking at this data that I could get my mum to de-anonymize it. It was just so easy to do. So I think the guidelines that are in are quite good. They basically say if a determined person wanted to de-anonymize that data, how much effort would he have to put in? And that's probably kind of the best guidelines. And I suppose the other kind of worrying things, I was at a conference a few years ago, funnily enough in Berlin, and I was at the bar with a couple of guys who works for some very well-known huge tech companies, and they reckoned they could de-anonymize most data. You know, they said it can all be done. So anonymized data, got to be really careful how that's done, how it's controlled. It might sound straightforward, but it can be a lot tougher. You know, information of the operation of the company, you know, a lot of this is intellectual property. It's how a company does stuff. How do you get that message across and make sure that actually it's kept confidential? As we kind of said, you know, how that data is used in the wrong hands. You know, I think it was on the news last night, wasn't it, that, you know, hackers are going mad on pharmaceutical companies and virus testing labs because that intellectual property could be so valuable. You know, it's not that there's any direct money involved, it's actually how that data can be sold further on. And of course the kind of favorite one, although, you know, I don't think we've seen a lot of this, is effectively kind of blackmail. You know, you can use data to offset one company against another company, and if that company knows, you know, they're being bought or invested in and they don't pay up, it'll be exposed that actually their data is all over the dark web of the internet. So, you know, there's a lot of angles on that, and, you know, we have seen, you know, I think that, you know, the ransomware scenarios is quite distressing because, you know, people haven't got access to it, then potentially they have to pay to get it released, but you're still in trouble even though you got your data back, because your data now has been exposed to people unknown, so you've almost certainly, if it's personal data, got a notifiable data breach. So it has to be controlled. And there is some kind of nice tech out there now which enables, you know, control of data in a much more granular fashion, which is where I think we're going. We're no longer kind of going, you know what, you can look at this data. It's now more, you can have this data, but you can only do certain things with this data. You can't take it out of the country. You can only have it for a fixed period of time, and then it will disappear. And that's probably where a lot more technology is hitting, rather than you can, I'll send you the file, or you can look at it in a secure vault, but actually, you know, there are other limitations that are actually implicit in that.
I heard of some investors even wanting that the raw data of the company for doing their own performance analysis in order to check how the company is doing, in order how to improve maybe marketing sites, etc.
Yeah, and we have seen that. And sometimes if that happens, we do kind of suggest that we create kind of a joint data warehouse that's controlled, that can be deleted afterwards with restricted access. And we know who's logged on, who's done the analysis, and make sure that data doesn't leave, you know, this virtual kind of environment, you know, because once it leaves an environment, you know, yes, you can have loads of contracts in place. Sometimes they'll be okay, but you can't necessarily guarantee that certain data has been removed, has been deleted. Yes, it is best practice, and yes, you can have it in a contract, but it's how do you verify that without extensive audit?
Yeah, so the data definitely need to be shared securely in a safe manner. We will speak about that. I was really surprised, for example, when I heard that most of the investors do not want to sign NDAs. But there's this popular misconception I had as well among first-time entrepreneurs that sharing an idea without signing a non-disclosure agreement will lead to someone stealing their idea. But investors want entrepreneurs and not ideas. We spoke to a lot of investors ourselves as Pride Tech. We have really good connections. So I was asking, and they say they don't want the ideas. They want the entrepreneurs. They invest in them. And anyone can up with a great idea, but a few can actually pull them off. And yeah, most of the investors really don't want to sign NDAs, and asking them even to will make you look like you don't know what you're doing, basically. This was the answer I got from a lot of investors.
And that's kind of true, because sometimes it's not the idea that makes the business valuable, it's actually the operation of that idea and the actions behind it. But quite often, you know, what we've seen is actually we can get investors to sign data sharing agreements, so they can't necessarily use at least personal data in any way they see fit. So there is kind of a legal obligation that they can be held to. Yeah, I'm not sure that many people have much success in forcing NDAs. In reality, it's more of a gentleman's agreement. Though we have seen some brilliant NDAs where and you can only do this if you're a $1 billion company, generally, that you say if anything kind of slightly goes wrong, you owe us $2 million or $100 million. Normally that puts people off signing it, but often you have no option if you want to do business with a really large company.
And at what stage of the investment funnel would you make them sign this agreement you were speaking about?
We would try and get them to do it as soon as there's any real kind of need for it, as soon as possible if we can. And I think the other thing is it also shows the investors you're on top of this kind of stuff, rather than just because you're an investor you have the right to have a look at everything. I mean, we come across when companies are externally audited and the auditor wants to look at certain information, and we go, yeah, you can kind of look at the redacted version, but you can't look at the real data, you know, because you have no need to look at the real data. You're not going to verify it. You're not going to do anything with it. You just need to know that it exists in some format. So, you know, you can do it, and quite often, you know, auditors will go with that. I mean, I don't think I've had any refuse to not audit stuff just because information and data has been redacted for their eyes. And that's also been a common problem where, you know, a lot of companies, when they have agreements, they put in the right to audit. And quite often that doesn't work so well, because yes, they have the right to audit, but they don't necessarily have the right to audit all the intellectual property of that company. So they can be quite restrictive in reality.
Yeah, absolutely. So because investors see so many deals, like over 1,000 a year, maybe the ones I was talking to, they also said signing an NDA with one company could potentially prevent them from having a meaningful discussion with another potential investment that comes afterwards.
Yeah, and I guess it's then down to trust levels, isn't it? Whether
Yeah,
you know you feel that trust level, but then also are you then exposing the trust of your customers as well? So you know you've got to take that into mind. And I think if you turned it around the other way, if you were an investor and you went to talk to a company who didn't try and enforce some kind of NDA or data sharing agreement, you'd be kind of worried. You'd go, these guys maybe are playing fast and loose, so why would you want to invest in them? So I think it
absolutely.
can work. I think it can work both ways.
And I really like the saying here. This is why I put it on top. Share the cookie, not the recipe. So if an investor really does not want to sign the NDA with you, you just have to see what you share with them. Share the cookie, not the recipe, and then you will.
Absolutely. I think that sums it up really, really well.
And yeah, most of them said when they are already a little bit down further the investment process, when you say when they do sign the term sheet, then they would be maybe willing to sign this NDA. But as you see, as a lawyer, I would say sign it as soon as possible, enforce it as soon as possible. This is what would I recommend the company, of course, but I can also understand the other side.
Yeah,
But
that makes sense. Yeah.
yeah, and here another thing to worry is more a bit the dissemination of the information. So I think that pitch decks and business plans can get shared very, very easily. And it's very helpful here to have a method to grant and revoke access online if possible, or only even present them when you are with the potential investors. I mean, this is very old fashioned, and nowadays with
Good
coronavirus
point.
even more harder. But yes, to share them only in person would be, of course, the most secure way here.
Good point. And what we kind of sometimes do, you know obviously recommend the documents classified appropriately. What that classification means is on the document, every page of that document has got the classification on it. And in certain circumstances, we say this document can only be shared with these people and name the names on the document as well. So if that document gets found somewhere else and it's not your name's not on it, by default someone has broken the agreement.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. Really good point. And this brings us also to the next point, the data room. So, of course, you must consider a data room before sharing the data, before starting the investment round, even. Right now, as we say, it's getting more virtual. So, you have a virtual data room, and there we need to see what you advise, what would be good, what you have to look in order to find a good data room to share the data with. Because, for example, if I would be an investor and they would use something very insecure, this would already stop me from investing in this company.
Absolutely, and I think you know the basics still apply. When you enter the data room, you ideally want some kind of multi-factor authentication. You want to make sure that the PCs or the devices that can access the data room are properly controlled. You know, everyone believes that they're not going to lose their laptop or it's not going to be compromised, but you know that's a risk. It's kind of like the seatbelt one, the seatbelt story. Before seatbelts were made compulsory, I don't know if you know people kind of remember there was a time you could drive a car without a seatbelt. I personally hate seatbelts, but I kind of wear them because what it means is you'll either get stopped by the police, or if you have an accident, you're probably not going to be in a good place. And when seatbelts first came out, they were only in the front seats, and then guess what? You know, a few years later, they were made compulsory in the back seats as well, because it's one of those things that everyone judges their own risk, and they go, yeah, it's not going to happen to me. And it's a bit like cybersecurity. Everybody goes, it doesn't happen to me, it happens to other people. And I think if the rules are set out, first of all, that this is how it's going to work, we take away that risk decision that people might want to make of their own accord and say, this is how it should work, this is how we work. And you know, it's not overly onerous to keep everything as safe as we can.
Absolutely. And I think here it's really important to ensure that any VDR meets the highest compliance and security standards for handling, especially, of course, the sensitive data of the company. And yeah, the VDR provider should leverage multiple data centers. I know for backups reasons, and various locations would be good. And there are
Absolutely.
some points from a GDPR perspective. What I think would be important, what I would look at if the data room is certified by the ISO norm 27001. So if it meets all the compliance standards here, there should be, of course, end-to-end encryption. From my perspective, anything else what you would look at
Yeah, no,
GDPR?
I think that's a really good starting point, because you know, the ISO 27001 standard is a measure of how you manage security. It's not necessarily how secure you are, but it's actually how you manage the process of security and to some extent data protection. And you know, one of the questions that we sometimes ask when we're involved with due diligence, we go, can we see your breach log? And quite often, and this doesn't necessarily apply to just startups, bigger companies as well, they go, we don't have a breach log. How come you don't have a breach log? Because you know, we've looked at companies that are 20 years old, maybe 3,000 staff globally, and there have been no incidents, no kind of cyber or breach incidents. The one thing you know is that's impossible. That just cannot be the case. So as an investor point of view, you already know a lot. You know that actually these aren't being logged, they aren't being handled, even if they're trivial ones that don't need reporting. You know, that log is almost a defensive mechanism, and two, it demonstrates that the company understands its responsibilities. You know, it's much better to have, you know, 5, 10 kind of minor things rather than you get a big thing and actually you can't demonstrate you can even handle a minor thing. So that's where the ISO comes in, because you can demonstrate, you can evidence stuff over a long period of time. Things are managed, things are governed, there's responsibility taken, actions are taken, and the risks are managed. At the end of the day, like the GDPR, it's a risk-based protocol, and it's how you are seen to manage that risk and demonstrating that risk is managed.
Absolutely, and demonstrating that you are aware of data security, just in that case, and the management. A thing you spoke before about was also a powerful access control, which I think is really important because you need the capacity to revoke access, and this is just so important as the capacity to grant the access to the investors, I think. And I think it would be a nice feature. I mean, I know data rooms have different features and a lot of them, but to create separate data room accesses for each investor, so you can also a bit like tailor the content. What are you sharing with whom? What is important to one and not important to the other?
Brilliant. And it goes back to kind of, you know, maybe even logging it as well. So you know that, you know, John was looking at this at this time of day and Peter was looking at this, and you know, then you've got a full handle on it, because you know, potentially you could also then look for anomalies. If somebody was meant to be in the UK and you can see they're accessing it from China or, you know, South America or, you know, even Scotland or whatever, you know that something might be wrong, because how do you
Yeah,
travel those distances so quickly?
absolutely. Very good point. I never thought of that.
Mm-hmm.
And also really good would be what I think what we did in our investment processes is read-only rights. So you don't want third parties to download or even edit your company data. So this is an important feature which data room should also totally have.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And you know, as we probably said before, maybe even a restriction on time as well. I mean, I won't kind of mention the name of the company that was big in the news recently, where their internal employees sold all their employee data, 100,000 employees on the dark web. The unfortunate part was he was the internal auditor, and he had the right to look at all 100,000 employees. I think where the gap is on things like that was, yes, he may have the right to look at 100,000 employees' data, but he didn't need to look at them all at once. They could have maybe restricted and say, yeah, you can look at 100 a day of any of these 100,000, because looking at 100,000 is not going to benefit anybody. Human brain certainly can't take it in. So, you know, it's having that more granularity where yes, you have the right to do it, but you don't necessarily need the whole cake or the whole cookie, as we were talking about before.
Absolutely. And speaking a bit about obligations of the investment fund or of the entrepreneurs, I think, as we spoke about before, confidentiality on both sides is really important. Just that you trust in each other and share the relevant documents.
Absolutely, and you know, sometimes there could be the case for even background checking sometimes on your investors. Quite often, if we're helping a company that's using a third-party company to do some very sensitive work, we'll say we want named people and we want to make sure that they're actually background checked as well. I know it's probably going to be tough to try and convince your investors if they want to look at this data, they need to be background checked, but sometimes that may be necessary, especially if you're kind of working with potentially fairly confidential government contracts. Everyone down that chain has got to be verified, background checked, to show that they really exist and there's no anomalies.
Absolutely. I would also maybe check a little bit the portfolio, because if I see that they invested already in like kind of a similar product, I would see it as also very difficult in order of the confidentiality here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it could be very difficult. That, you know, as you say, the implication is, you know, ideas are going to be borrowed and swapped around.
So, and then the investment fund should, of course, and will definitely check if they're buying this data cyber security breach, which you spoke about. So this is also important for them, because the company can lose a lot of its evaluation just by having a data breach.
And that's the thing is, you know, if a company's been around maybe a couple of years, maybe less, how do you know that there hasn't been a breach, you know, day one, 6 months ago, a year ago? And the only kind of real defense is that company got enough accountability and an evidential trail to show they did the best they could. Because I think it's probably generally accepted everybody is vulnerable, but it's how you handle it and how you can demonstrate you're handling it to the best of the company's ability and resources. And that's probably the, you know, the first line of defense. But if there's no evidence of any of this happening, then, you know, it doesn't necessarily bode well. And I'm sure you've done it, I'm sure you do all the time, more than I do. When you look for the enforcement notices, they're quite often not for the breach, they're often for the bad practice that surrounded the breach, where they're getting the fines.
Yeah, absolutely. For even like not notifying it correctly, not within time. Absolutely. And if I have a breach, you mentioned that I have to notify it at the FCA, correct?
No, I think, sorry, if the company's financially regulated, yeah, they may, it may not actually be within direct scope of the UK ICO Data Protection Authority. They all need to go through the Financial Conduct Authority if they're regulated by them, and it's they who will decide whether the Data Protection Authority is involved or not. In the kind of good old days, when the data protection was actually managed by, you know, the Financial Services Authority, when it was they're the ones that issued the data protection fines, and they were pretty heavy. You know, there was a case, I think 2010, not really that long ago, a big insurance company lost a laptop. There was no evidence that that data was compromised or used anywhere, but they were still fined 900,000. You know, and they fined in the millions, and that was well before GDPR, because it was a financial company and they felt that the, you know, usage of this financial information was not appropriate. So they were quite keen on doing pretty large fines, you know, by 2010 standards, 11 standards.
Good to know that the ICO is not the first go-to authority in each and every data breach. Because I would have definitely first gone to the ICO.
Yeah, there was one, what was it? I think it's 2017. One of the supermarket banks, they had a breach and they were fined by the FCA. I think it was 22 million for that. Wow. Because it came under their category of fraud. So, you know, the ICO didn't even get a look in, and that wasn't even a GDPR fine. That was a financial fine for effectively having a data breach.
Okay, and we spoke before about data and product roadmap. That goes basically hand in hand. Speaking here also a bit about privacy by design, privacy by default, and that we said that it has to be reviewed on a regular basis.
Absolutely. You know, we recommend for many companies that we kind of work with that, you know, this is done, you know, not just at change control, because change control is a nice kind of gateway, but unfortunately the time things get to change control, they're probably already developed. So it's usually kind of better before the concept's even started. You know, we design special checklists for businesses. So yeah, we're thinking of doing this, we're using this new system, we're going to use this data for this purpose, and then they can kind of run through a simple checklist whether actually this needs to be put past their data protection professionals to have a look at, make sure the relevant safeguards are in place, and if needed, maybe a data protection impact assessment. And all this kind of demonstrates data protection, by default and design. Often the mere fact there is a DPIA in place means that, the company has thought about the risks, how they're going to manage them, focused on the data subject rather than the business risks.
Absolutely. So just to explain, because I think privacy by design is a complex concept, and if you hear it the first time, maybe as a company, you don't even know what it means, what you have to do. It is basically an approach taken when creating new technologies and systems. It is when privacy is incorporated into tech and systems by default, basically. So your product is designed with privacy as a priority, along with whatever other purposes in the system serves, of course, but privacy here is a priority.
Absolutely.
Exactly. I mean, we can go into detail with this. Companies should have a closer look at it. Absolutely, there are the 7 principles, very well known. I think we don't go into detail here on all of them. This will be probably an own webinar by itself.
Absolutely,
but yeah, let's just say they need to be like proactive, not reactive. And embed the privacy basically in the design
the more
the
proactive,
product.
the better outcomes generally. Yeah, absolutely.
And I heard from a lot of companies they wanted to do it. Then, of course, afterwards they designed the product, then thought about it, and it was just we could see that the service level was then just lower because the product was not designed in with the privacy as priority. So that the outcome was that the product then, when we embedded the privacy, functional a bit. Right.
And we've seen the same in other industries. There was a time, when cars first came out, it was like, wow, automated car, no horses, we can go really fast. There was no real design for sort of safety or how good the driver was. I think the UK invented the speeding fine in 1894. We had to have highly trained policemen who could see a car doing more than 2 miles an hour, and then they had the ability to find them. And so what that really meant was, it wasn't that let's do the concept, let's see how well it goes, and let's worry about compliance afterwards. It kind of changed. Things have got to be safe first, a bit like same as the food industry. Then you can market it, then you can do all the cool stuff. And I think really when we're looking at technology now, we have to look at it that way. Can we match the compliance? Does it do what we want? Yeah. And can we manage it, rather than the other way around? Can it do cool stuff? Because I think we all know we can all do cool stuff with tech, but can we do it in a safe manner and a compliant manner?
I really love your car analogies. They make it so much more relatable. That's great. No, it's great. Then a last point, using technology to make data protection evolve in the product. So automate the legal processes through the software that allows to control the evolution of the product.
Yeah, this is a kind of really interesting area, because if we kind of step back a few steps, and I have a lot of discussions with my kind of cyber colleagues and data protection colleagues, and they kind of go, and I totally agree up to a level that, awareness and training helps a lot of this stuff. But actually, when you look at the stats, I think that the stats for breaches, 90 to 94% of all breaches are human error. And that fact's been around for at least 10, 15 years. And that kind of says to me, I don't get this. Why are we designing products with such a human rate of error? And going back to the car analogy, if we had such huge failures in cars and airplanes and other systems, we probably wouldn't be driving cars or flying planes. But what we allow is a 94% human error for data breaches, which kind of means, are we designing our technology in the best way to deal with human needs? Probably not as well. We've gone for functionality. The functionality is incredible, but it's not necessarily been designed for cyber. And then if we take it back a step further, we now have this extra layer. Yeah, we know we can do anything with data, but now it's got to be legal. You can't process the data without a legal basis. And you come across this as well as I do. Often the legal basis can change throughout the journey of the same data. You may take on a customer, you may put him in marketing, you may invite him to an event. It's endless. legal basis could be different in all cases.
Yep.
You know, we've come across charities where, you know, they have somebody who's a beneficiary of the charity, they have someone who's a donor of the charity, there's someone who helps out with events. There's, you know, we had one particular case where one person was in 5 different categories, and he decided he didn't want to be on their marketing thing anymore. So he effectively asked his name to be removed. And the way their systems were designed, if you removed his name, he came out of the other 4 categories. So often the way we design data needs to be thought through, that it can be compliant with legal processes and data protection from the ground up.
Exactly. I mean, this would be the first step. And then also, of course, implementing a data protection program and also monitoring it. I think this is what you do with your clients as well, I reckon.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we try to kind of facilitate with them questions they should be asking, how to answer questions from investors. We have checklists for them, and also how do you manage the risk on an ongoing basis that can be demonstrated. And sometimes it's quite radical, but often actually, you know, when it works really well, and you've got buy-in, and it's not a major overhead. Once the groundwork's done, it's actually pretty straightforward, and it stops a lot of problems coming up ahead. It does mean that you can deal with your, you know, your customers, your investors, and it just becomes business as usual, and it's not overly kind of difficult to do.
I saw the same. When we onboard new clients, the first months are a lot of work, but then from there it's basically smooth sailing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, and I think most companies, in fact, I'd say most companies, all companies pretty much want to do the right thing, but often they're not sure how they do it and how do you make it cost effective. Because you know, unfortunately, you know, I think banks, the latest stats I read on banks was 10% of their workforce is based on compliance, and probably reality it's higher. And maybe even in smaller companies, you know, we all have to file tax returns and health and safety and data protection. So relatively a percentage of doing business now is just dedicated compliance of one sort or another.
Exactly. So now I want to go a bit in a case of one of our clients is Startup Jokerus. And first of all, I love to work with startups because there you can really build the data security from scratch. This is what I love. They have nothing and you can implement it in your way, in the way you think is best, of course. There we can help them because they are a health startup and growing a lot with COVID-19. So of course they need a DPO. And we are helping them and conducting all the DPO work. Then we have to say here, as you said as well, impact assessments really important. When dealing with sensitive data, you have to conduct the data protection impact assessments and also carry them out for, let's see, the processing activities. Sometimes you can bundle them. Of course, you don't need for each processing activity, but for the important ones. And what we have with a lot of companies, I don't know if for you it's the same, a lot request like HIPAA compliance. So today companies want to go abroad, companies want to grow big in the USA, and this is why a lot of us request to conduct also the HIPAA compliance. You have the same?
Absolutely. And yeah, we do. And we don't have HIPAA, but there are kind of guidelines when you're dealing with health data. Generally, most kind of medical operations follow the code of conduct by the NHS, which is kind of written in there that it should apply to the private parts of health as well. Yeah, so that there has to be a way. Otherwise, you know, doctors as well, they have to, when they write their notes up, they could be liable. So those notes have got to be safe. And if they're working in, you know, a private practice or an NHS stuff, you know, they've got to be working to the same standard everywhere. So everybody knows exactly how to handle that data. So yeah, the standards are pretty rigorous. In fact, actually, probably with the incoming GDPR, I think they've made them even more robust, with the sensitive special categories of data need to be, you know, protected and managed to a much higher level.
Absolutely, and I think nowadays also investors are aware of this. At least what I saw, they have at least a little knowledge of GDPR, data protection, sensitive data. So of course, then when health tech is applying for a fund, then it's important that they also check that they have especially a solid ground in GDPR compliance.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And and as we know, the kind of probably every component of GDPR is not that difficult. It's just when you put it all together, the complexity maxes out. You've got to look at your supply chain. Is any data going to them? Are they looking after the health data appropriately? How do you transfer it? Are your staff background checked to the right level to be dealing with this type of data? It's every component. When you put it together, that's why these things suddenly become a little bit more complex than maybe expected.
Yeah. And as you said, the topic is really complex, the topic of data protection. This is why PridaTech is also, of course, a platform in order to help with GDPR compliance. So what I think is really important, and the first step is to detect and identify the risks in your company. This you have to do in order to then be able to mitigate them. So this with the platform you can do. Later on, you define and suggest measures, of course, in order to mitigate those risks. But then what we said before several times now, it is very important to monitor the implementation, to check up, to make regular checks, how it evolves. If the risk lower down, of course, this gives also a better, higher evaluation in any investment process. Then with PridaTech, of course, you can conduct a lot of things. You can have risk assessments, impact assessments. What also is really important is to have a list of the technical and organizational measures in your company and to fill in privacy reports. Investment funds really want to see you have to have control over everything, every private data in your company, so also international transfers. So this is a really great solution, of course, and everyone can try PridaTech, especially made also, of course, for startups, and you can contact us for a free demo anytime. Now I will have a quick look if we have any questions for you, David. There's in fact there's one, and they are asking if you have any recommendations for a safe data room, virtual data room. If you can give any recommendations about that.
Probably better not do that on the webinar, yeah. But if they get in touch, we can kind of put them in the right direction. Yeah.
Exactly. We have put your information here. On the front side, every participant of the webinar will receive, of course, the PowerPoint from us, will receive the video, and there are all your contact details, and then everybody can get in contact with you about that.
Yeah, and they can also, if they want, they can have a free checklist for the C-suite, what questions to ask, your business to make sure that you're in the right direction for data protection and cybersecurity.
Of course, yeah, exactly. We spoke about this before. They just need to contact us, then we will, of course, send it out. This was a very interesting webinar for me as well. I learned a lot, also a lot about cars. So thank you so much, David.
Thank you, Lisa. It was fun. Thank you so much.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.